Margaret Lance was getting on in years, but she was still in amazing physical shape for someone of her advanced age. Before her disappearance, she would often tell people that she grew decades younger after her kids moved out, but she knew all too well that such a thing was not possible. Yes, by all accounts, her twin boys could have easily been confused for the hellspawn offspring of the devil himself, but she would tend to point a finger at her late husband for that. "It takes two to tango," Gabriel Lance would insist when she would pass him the blame for the way their children turned out, and he wasn't wrong. Margaret was never one to accept fault in her actions, nor was she prone to showing any affection in a recognizable manner, even toward her own flesh and blood. The inherent irony in her claims that Gabe was the root of every problem her humble family ever suffered was that somewhere in the back of her mind, she had no doubt that she was indeed the one who brought such suffering to the one she never truly loved. At 67 years old, over the days leading up to the last time anyone in the little town would set eyes on her, one could argue that she did not look as though she'd passed her mid-40s yet. Some would profess that it was likely due to some extreme makeover, or perhaps some extravagant plastic surgery she was able to afford with a hefty life insurance settlement from her husband's passing. Naturally, they would never expect her to admit something like that, as she was notoriously far too proud for her own good at times. Yes, she would carefully apply her makeup every morning before she would even think about being seen in public, but her powders, blush, and lipstick had little influence on her appearance. Though they would indeed add a dash of color to the otherwise pale skin, her youthful demeanor was a far more recent and much less natural occurrence. In addition, the only surgery she had ever undergone over her nearly 7 decades of life was a simple appendectomy. It was only a few months before her husband's untimely demise that she happened upon the quaint little pawn shop. She was always fond of these little hole-in-the-wall places, regardless of the fact she had far more expensive taste than the average such establishment could provide. It was more the experience of places like these that she loved, the ambience and scent of such aged and time-worn items they held within. She had walked the aisles of many through the years, allowing herself to create a mystery behind every bauble and trinket she would look upon. She would craft such intricate tales in the back of her curious mind, each one guiding her subconscious to faraway lands to uncover the truth behind these hidden and forgotten treasures. It was little more than a game to distract her mind from the life she had grown to hate, and it brought a smile to her face nonetheless. While she cut her eyes from one glorious treasure to the next, she was so focused on her fantasies that she almost jumped out of her skin when she felt a hand caress the small of her back. "What in the—" she cried out, spinning to see the tall, well-dressed man. "I'm so sorry, my dear. I didn't mean to startle you," he said, with a warm smile reaching across his lips. Her alarmed demeanor transformed to that of an almost bashful schoolgirl when her eyes met those of the stranger. Though she was immediately struck by his chiseled features, it was his voice that caused her pulse to quicken. Margaret was far from worldly, but she had often dreamt of crossing the pond to jolly old England, as the phrase goes. She instantly recognized the man's accent to be that of a upper-class Londoner, were she to wager a guess. "I only wanted to ask if there was anything I could do to assist you in finding something to suit your tastes," he said, placing his hand back on her lower back. The warmth of his large palm combined with the depth of the tone of his voice to inspire goosebumps to line her arms and neck. She giggled as her face flushed, feeling both embarrassed and quite enamored by the stranger. "Well, I was only browsing," she replied, refusing to admit to herself that she was indeed attempting to adjust her ordinary, crude accent to match that of the most interesting individual. "Perhaps, with a little assistance, you may not yet leave empty-handed, he said, gently rubbing the small of her back. "I own this humble shop, and I'm often prone to granting discounts to such lovely young ladies, such as yourself." "Well, I'm sure. Perhaps this way?" He gestured to the left with a tilt of his hand, entwining Margaret's fingers within his own, before guiding her onward. She no longer took much interest in the fantastical and mysterious items that surrounded her, only in the charming individual whose company she shared at the time. That was, of course, until they came to a stop, with the man cutting his gaze from hers to what lay before where he stood. when her eyes met the intricate and filigree-adorned doorknob sitting alone on a simple wooden shelf in an otherwise plain cabinet. Even her imagination could not conjure anything to create its origin. Why something like this captured her mind and filled her senses with wonder, she could not say, but she just knew she must possess it. On any normal day, she would leave empty-handed, having satisfied her wandering mind for the time, but not this one. She glanced back to the handsome shop owner as he twirled the left curl of his mustache between his fingers, and back to the article upon the shelf, as though to ask permission to pick it up. He gave her another smile, accompanied by a single nod, which was all she needed to snatch up her new fantastical thing. She made a little more small talk with the man while she completed her purchase, only pausing slightly when he pulled open a leather-bound book, handing her a very pretty fountain pen. "If you would be so kind," he said, spinning the open ledger to face her. She cocked her head to one side, allowing the smile she had worn since meeting the man to fade. "Each and every item upon these shelves and walls have a story, my dear. I would be remiss should I allow any to leave here without a record of who the new owner is." She was already scribbling her name across the page, while still not breaking her gaze from the man before her. Somehow, the fact that he seemed to care for these things enough to keep track of where they went made him even more enticing to her. While she traced her eyes across his face, taking in the sight of the small scar above his left eyebrow, one just below his hairline, and another on his chin, she could only imagine the stories he could share with her. He took great care in wrapping up her new treasure before placing it down in the bottom of a tall paper bag. She still could not break her eyes away from his face as he gently rolled the tip of the bag down to meet where the beautiful brass sphere now awaited her to grant it freedom. Even as she strolled towards the door, she took frequent glances behind her until she passed back through to the world beyond the quaint little shop. Though her large purse had more than enough room to store her new purchase, she held the paper bag tightly within her grip, refusing to allow it to leave her sight. To an observer, she may have seemed like some mad woman attempting to shield her newborn from the dangers of the outside world, rather than $20 worth of antique doorknob in a sack. She still kept it close to her over the bus ride back to her street, darting her eyes erratically between her fellow passengers as if they sought to rob her of her new prize. When she returned to the home she shared with her husband and twin sons, she finally allowed her grip to release, freeing her treasure from its entrapment. She just stared at it after setting it down on the chipped and stained coffee table, almost feeling guilty for allowing something so beautiful upon something so ugly and worn. She didn't move it, only glared at it as though it was looking back at her. "What's that?" Timothy asked, with Reginald only feet behind him. She hadn't even noticed them re-entering the house. She hadn't even realized it was time for them to arrive home from school, for that matter, but she still felt her back tense as soon as they broke her from her pensive state. "It's a new doorknob, for my bedroom," she replied, still not pulling her eyes away from it. Though she hadn't quite decided if the door to the bedroom she shared with her husband would indeed be the prime location for her prize, she felt she had to give them something. They would always pry into her business, something they had no right to do. She was the adult after all. Why should she have to explain anything to her spoiled and arrogant, shitty little teenage boys? They should show her the respect she never earned, and she would have no part of their disrespect. "Why do you need a new one?" Reginald asked, screwing up his face as though his upper lip smelled like week old garbage. "The old one broke or something?" "No, I just wanted a new one," Margaret replied with a heavy and exhausted sigh. "Is that okay?" "Whatever," Timothy said, clapping his brother on the shoulder before they both left the room, sprinting up the stairs to their shared bedroom. She rolled her neck, causing a series of pops and cracks to echo from the tension beginning to release. Though she wouldn't outwardly admit that the sight of her children would sometimes make her feel physically ill, while the sound of their voices would cause her teeth to clench together, there were times she even imagined gently nudging them as they stood at the top of the staircase, but the fear of them ending up handicapped, requiring far more care than she was prepared to give them, convinced her to never act on such fantasies. She felt her muscles clench once more after ascending the stairs to reach her own bedroom, as the sounds of virtual warfare bellowed from the closed door closest to the landing. She was against her husband's desire to buy the video game systems for her boys, as she always found such things to be disruptive to the mind, but she purchased them anyway. Gabriel went out of his way to spoil the boys with whatever they wanted, but he didn't have to deal with them much. His job kept him away from the house for so many of the day's hours, but the money he earned did allow Margaret to enjoy a mostly carefree lifestyle. Yes, he had plans to retire soon, but not until the boys left for college. She was certain that he wanted to remain distant from both her and his sons, but he would never admit to that. Sometime after the sun finished its descent for the night, while Margaret still gazed upon her wonderful treasure, the lights flickered on in the living room, effectively pulling her from her near hypnotic daze. "Why are you sitting alone in the dark?" Gabe asked, standing in the doorway, loosening his tie.
"Oh, I didn't... No reason. Why are you home so early?"
"Early? It's almost 10, he replied with a chuckle. "You feeling all right?"
"I'm fine, yes. Go make sure the boys went to bed, would you?"
Gabe sighed, softly shaking his head while cutting his eyes upward, as though he could see into their kid's bedroom from where he stood.
"Okay,"
he said, dropping his briefcase to the floor, scuffling his feet across the carpet as he walked to the stairs.
"It's not like I've been working all day while you sat on your ass or anything."
Though he barely spoke the words in a little more than a mumble, Margaret heard every single one. Finally looking away from the doorknob, she stared imaginary knives at her husband of 30 years as he heavily stomped up each step, seemingly still cursing under his breath. She winced with every single pound of his glossy black shoes, almost wishing that the slippery soles would send him careening back to the floor below. Ultimately, and unfortunate for her peace of mind, he returned a little while later, having convinced the boys to cut the games off and hit the sack. He had showered and changed into his pajamas before strolling back into the living room to find his wife still vacantly gazing at her shiny new bauble.
"You two need a room?"
he asked, forcing a false chuckle to imply he was joking.
"Would you be our dear and install this on the bedroom before bed?"
she asked, making her best attempt at a loving and gentle smile.
"I'm beat, hon. Can't wait until..."
"But it'll look so good on the door. Come on. Surely you can find enough energy to do this one little thing for me,
Her words were intended to sound almost playful, but she couldn't quite hide away that sarcastic and arrogant tone from beneath the surface. As Gabe looked from his wife to the silly doorknob sitting in the center of the table, he allowed the briefest smirk to cross his lips as the visual image of him pounding it against her forehead until the skull caved in danced across his subconscious.
"Sure,"
he replied, having been somewhat re-energized by his momentary daydream.
"Let me get my tools."
The 3 layers of paint long since dried across the Phillips head screws of the original doorknob made the task a little more annoying than it should have been, but it didn't take him too long after that. Yes, he cursed under his breath the whole time about how she was the one that changed her mind about the color scheme far too many times over the years, but he did have that feeling of achievement when the job was done. The majority of the tools Gabe kept stored away in the basement had seldom been used, as he was far from a handyman. At least 70% of them were pure impulse purchases, but at the time, he convinced himself he'd need them someday. Whenever the opportunity presented itself, however, he was quick to call in a professional to perform the simplest of jobs. A couple of the screwdrivers, drills, and hammers got plenty of use. Hang a picture here, knock a few nails in the deck there, install a new fucking doorknob at damn near midnight. As he pushed himself up from the floor, while his knees attempted to buckle and throb from being pressed against the carpet for so long, he couldn't help but feel proud of the work he'd done. He took a few steps back, stretching out his back while gazing at the fruits of his labor.
"Not bad, huh?"
he said, giving his wife a slight smirk and a wink.
"I told you it'd look nice,"
she replied, somehow finding a way to take full credit for the work he did. He rolled his eyes at the fact his wife could not locate a single word of gratitude, but he expected that much. He couldn't recall any such time she had thanked him for anything over the decades they had spent together, but he didn't care. To many, the simple act of installing a doorknob would be nothing to brag about, but to Gabriel Lance, well, he felt almost invigorated from getting his hands dirty, so to speak. During his daily pre-work routine the following day, he still beamed back at the job well done before descending the stairs to begin another day at the office. When Margaret awakened, she too admired the lovely new adornment once her boys had left for school. She would lightly brush her fingers across the reflective brass on the frequent unnecessary jaunts to her bedroom as the day progressed. And it was on maybe the fourth or fifth of such visitations when she noticed the script inscribed across her new trinket.
Fioil it eoer?
She said under her breath, attempting to read aloud the unusual word.
Foelitior,
a whispered voice repeated from somewhere behind the door to her bedroom. She took a step back, feeling her pulse begin to quicken. That was not from fear, but excitement, perhaps? She was already so fascinated by the simple, polished object that now protruded from the door, had been since the first time she set eyes on it. But on a normal day, she would never be prone to speaking aloud to disembodied voices. This, it would seem, was no ordinary day.
Fioletior?
She said once more, with far more confidence in her pronunciation, now that it had been read back to her.
and you?
The soft voice asked, still breathing from seemingly beneath and around the door.
Margaret,
she stuttered, suddenly feeling as bashful as she did so many years before, back when she was such a shy little girl.
Margaret Lance.
No.
No?
No, Lance. You.
She studied the now somewhat shimmering brassy sphere, pondering its meaning for a moment.
I am... oh yes,
she exclaimed, suddenly understanding.
I am Margaret Dolores Sloane.
Lance, of course, was her husband's surname, one that she never truly cared for. Back when they wed, it was downright unseemly for a woman to maintain her birth name when betrothed. It was clear the intelligence behind the door was as uninterested in Gabriel as she had grown.
Margaret.
The voice breathed once more.
Thaan Takras Orm.
She cocked her head to one side, not unlike the adventurous bloodhound her parents had owned in her youth. She understood these words even less than the first one the voice had whispered to her, but she was unsure if any sort of interrogation may scare away her new friend. Unfortunately, she was certain that granting it no reply would inspire his departure also.
I'm so sorry,
she said in a far more gentle tone than she had ever spoken to her family.
I don't understand.
Her chest tightened with her words, as she simply could not lose this magnificent thing. During the handful of words they had exchanged over such a brief moment in time, she already ached to please it.
Margaret.
It called softly again.
I am hungry.
Oh.
Margaret had never used a tool in her entire life, except for those used for knitting and crochet. Even those she never really got the hang of, as her fingers would clumsily fumble them around as she desperately attempted to teach herself a new hobby. It had also been many years since she worked any sort of job, as her husband provided her with everything she needed. Yes, she could barely stand the sight of the man after all their years together, but she did enjoy the comforts he provided. It was a conundrum for certain, but this was not her concern at the moment. At this time, she wished that she had paid more attention to the work Gabriel performed the previous night, at least the actual tools he used for the job. She practically had to drag his overstuffed bag of tools up the steps, as they were far heavier than she had anticipated. Even when she finally reached the top, it took her a good deal of trial and error to locate the one she would need, and she was getting more clumsy with every minute that ticked by. She only had an hour or so left to get the deed done, but she could not risk waiting for the next day. It was hungry now, after all. She worked on the door to the boys' room before risking inflicting any damage to her beloved doorknob. She could scratch up this one all she wanted while she experimented with the procedure, but she must have it down to a science before inadvertently gouging into the brass of the other. After a great deal of effort, causing an almost foreign sensation of sweat dripping from her brow, Margaret finally freed the dingy and stained knob from the door. Unfortunately, time had whittled down far more than she felt comfortable with, as the boys would be arriving any minute now. She darted her eyes from one door to the other, feeling her heart race at the impossibility of being able to accomplish her goal. Only moments later, before she even had a hope of completing her task, she heard the stomping feet and obnoxious voices of her demon spawn just outside the house. She quickly dragged the heavy bag of tools to the guest bedroom across the hall, tossing the old knob in behind them. With only seconds to concoct a plan to see her goal bear fruit, she tidied her hair up to the best of her ability while erratically cutting her gaze from one direction to another.
Mom!
Reginald screamed out as he entered the house.
What's for dinner? I'm hungry.
You're not the only one, she thought, fighting off a chuckle when the idea began to form.
Where you at, Ma?
Timothy called out in an even more agitated tone than his brother.
I'm upstairs, boys. What for?
Reg asked, causing Margaret's face to burn, as it was not his business whatever she was doing in her own damn house.
I have a present for you, boys,
she replied, attempting to calm the combination of rage and anticipation building from within. Seconds later, the two were stomping up the steps, sounding as though they were practically falling over one another. Clearly, they were quite excited to have a prize awaiting them, but they would be unlikely to enjoy the surprise.
Where is it?
Timothy asked, gasping for breath from the enthusiastic assent.
Yeah, what'd you get us?
Reginald sneered, seemingly already prepared to be underwhelmed.
It's in my bedroom,
Margaret replied, attempting to force her voice to be gentle and genuine.
Just head on in and you'll see it on... Your room?
Timothy belted.
Why is it in there?
It was a fair question, considering that particular room was normally completely off limits to the two. In the past, their mother had practically threatened to send them both to the gallows if they had the gall to intrude in her sanctuary.
That's your father's fault,
she claimed, puzzling her plan together like a riddle.
He brought it home earlier and sat it on our bed. He knew it was too heavy for me to pick up, but you know him.
She considered this a truly brilliant solution, a stroke of genius even. The boys knew all too well what their mother thought of their dad's decision-making abilities. Not only did this throw him under the bus if this didn't go how she hoped, but it also implied that their gift was something of significant mass. Something expensive, perhaps. They took the bait like an absent-minded fish, moronically snatching up fresh worms sent from the heavens. She felt the excitement reaching its breaking point as the two charged towards the door to her sanctum without another word. Her arms and the nape of her neck tingled as the goosebumps formed across the surface of the flesh. She just gazed onward, while Reginald wrapped his fingers around her precious knob, only momentarily feeling a stab of anger strike her as her son caressed her beloved. It wasn't until he pulled the door ajar that her mouth dropped, her jaw hanging agape at the sight of what lay beyond the threshold of what was once the bedroom she shared with a husband she detested. The twin boys shrieked in unison as they gazed upon the waiting mouth, dripping thick and foul-smelling saliva from what was once a simple ceiling with a fan in its center. There was no trace of the rosy pastel pink walls, the flowered comforter covering the king-size bed that was big enough for the parents to never come in contact with one another while they slept, only the slick inner lining of the gaping maw. Before the fear completely consumed them, they attempted to back away, turning back to their mother, begging for help. But there would be no assistance. As Reginald and Timothy both outstretched their arms toward the one who betrayed them, the realization of what she had done was reflected in their gaze. As whatever the beast beyond the door was, inhaled a deep breath, Reg instantly found himself being pulled inside, unable to grab onto anything to fight against it.
Why?
Timothy asked, gripping his fingers tightly onto the doorframe. In Margaret's defense, she did attempt to answer his final question, but she was incapable of producing words at the time. Yes, this was what she wanted, but be it the horror of what she was looking upon, or the sheer exhilaration of finally being rid of her sons, she could offer him nothing. As hard as her only remaining son was fighting to hang on as the suction only increased, Margaret was somehow not affected by it. When she could command her limbs to function, she simply paced toward the one who still begged for her to help him. She just stared into his eyes, allowing a small smile to breach across her lips before she reached out to the door displayed open beside her.
For what it's worth,
she said, gazing down on her son with contempt in her eyes.
You were my favorite.
The second the words left her mouth, she slammed the door shut, sealing him away from her once and for all. Though the heavy inhale from the mouth within had not affected her, it took hold of the door as soon as she pulled it from the wall. With how hard the thick wood met the frame, it easily clipped off the fingers, which had gripped tightly onto it only moments before. Margaret let out a sigh when she looked down at the 8 bloody stumps lying on the floor. She opened the door back up, intending to nudge the severed digits across the threshold, but only her bedroom sat behind the entrance again. After fetching her cleaning supplies from the kitchen, she tossed the last remains of her favorite son into a sandwich bag, just in case her beloved may need a snack at some point. After the cleaning was done and the knob replaced on the boy's bedroom door, Margaret was thrilled to have the opportunity to rest a bit before her husband would be home. She was quite exhausted from the far more busy day than she was used to, but the peaceful quiet of the house while her sons would normally still be awake made the hard day's work worth every drop of sweat. She didn't even realize she had fallen asleep until Gabe woke her up with his feet stomping almost as loudly as the boys. As she groggily stared at him, laying down his briefcase and kicking off his shoes, she wondered if her love may still be hungry. Perhaps, if he were to creak open the door to the bedroom, she could finally be rid of all of them. Not only that, but she may even be able to cash in a sizable life insurance policy to carve out a new and wonderful life for herself and her new friend. It was while she pondered that very thing, as Gabriel made his way up the stairs, that it dawned on her. Should he too be swallowed up by the entity beyond the door, there won't be a body. There's no chance that life insurance would pay off without proof of death. She almost toppled to the floor as her still sleepy legs only shuddered beneath her as she broke free of the cozy couch.
Wait!
She cried out, slapping her trembling limbs to force them to work the proper way. Gabe was already clutching the doorknob by the time she reached the landing at the top of the stairs, with her heart hammering against her sternum.
Huh? What's up, hon?
He asked, still holding on to the smooth brass sphere.
Are you hungry?
She stuttered, grasping at anything she could to halt his attempt to enter the room.
Nah, Whoa! Did you get a makeover? You look amazing.
What? No, wait!
He still stared at her as he turned the knob. The world felt as though it moved in slow motion to Margaret as she attempted to rush toward her husband. As he pulled the door ajar, she screamed out again, gripping her fingers around his arm.
You okay?
He asked, cutting his eyes from her face to the hand holding his forearm.
Oh,
she said, looking from him to the bedroom they shared, blanketed by the cover of night.
Yes, I must have had a strange dream or something.
She giggled, feeling her face flush.
Oh my god,
Gabe said after flicking on the light switch.
You look even better in the light. You know what I mean. I'm just saying. That's one hell of a makeover.
What are you talking about?
He gripped her by the arm now, leading her to the vanity mirror in the corner of the wide room. She could barely believe her eyes as she gazed upon the reflection she had not seen in the better part of a decade. She ran her fingers across the far less wrinkled face than she had still expected to feel, regardless of what the mirror showed her.
So where'd you get it done?
Gabe asked.
Do they do man too?
Oh, it's a new place in town. I just wanted to.
Well, they do amazing work,
he said with a heavy yawn.
Anyway, I gotta get in the shower. Long day tomorrow.
Neither why Gabe hadn't asked about the boys, nor what she was going to do about him were on Margaret's mind as she attempted to sleep. Only the strange transformation she had apparently been through. When she did finally locate slumber, she was pulled back out of it by a series of pounding noises, ending with a sudden bang. Gabriel hadn't sleepwalked in over 15 years, ever since a few rounds of hypnotherapy. Though Margaret hadn't given much credit to such mad signs, she couldn't deny the results. What had inspired her husband's late-night stroll into the darkened hallway, or the subsequent plummet down the stairs to the floor below, she could not say, but it would seem that all of her woes may well have ended that night. There would be an investigation, but it would turn up nothing more than an accidental death. Still, Margaret could not explain why not even the nosy busybodies next door even inquired about their twin son's disappearance. Their things remained in their vacant bedroom, but it would seem that there was no lingering memory of their existence to anyone but the lady of the house. Over the months that followed Gabriel Lance's untimely demise, his widow invited a few of her nosy neighbors over to inspect the renovations she had made to the bedroom she had once shared with another. Their houses are still on the market, fully furnished with no records of who the previous owners were. The home in which the Lance family once lived is up for sale as well. It's going for a decent price, so if you don't mind the faint bloodstains on the wooden landing at the base of the stairs, it's quite a reasonable offer. It should be noted, though, that it will be necessary to install new knobs on the master bedroom door. It may be tricky to locate the owner, of course, as Margaret Dolores Lance has not been seen in some time. Fortunately, it would seem the old woman had a niece, a charming and beautiful young lady who currently lives in London, England. It has been said by those who knew the family that Maggie Violatior is the spitting image of the Lance widow, back when she was still in her 30s, but she does not seem fond of the comparison. Though she is such a friendly and outgoing young woman, for one reason or another, the houses on either side of her never stay occupied for long. There are some who believe that the buildings in the area might be haunted. Though the young Miss Violatior lives alone, passers-by often hear strange voices coming from within, whether the owner is home or not. It is something of an inviting voice, mind you, one that feels as though it may just be capable of whisking one away from this world entirely. Of course, that's just a preposterous thing to even consider, wouldn't you think?